Dr. Lindsay Wu, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And we're calling this project 100. I should say, welcome to Project 100, mate.
Great to be here.
Now, maybe I noticed on here you got an NHMRC grant, or that tells me you're pretty smart because they're pretty hard to get. And I know that for a fact. Not too many of those are handed out. So what is your research area?
Yeah.
So you're doing a fellowship?
Yeah, that's right. So, I'm on a fellowship right now. I'm actually ended the NHMRC one, and I'm funded by the American Federation for Aging Research and Evolution, which is
that's a new one. I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, so it's a brand new organization set up by the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund for aging research.
Right.
Which sort of gets into what I do. So
the Saudis are interested in this stuff too as well right now.
Yeah, that's right. So Evolution is an enormous organization.
What do you call it?
Evolution.
Hev.
Yeah, so evolution with an H.
Yeah, but what does that mean? Evolution, like
I don't know where the name comes
from,
to be honest. But they're they're putting substantial funds both towards basic research and private investment in longevity and aging research.
Wow,
which is my specialty.
Well, that's perfect for you. So what have you been working on? Can you just give us a bit of a flavor of the sorts of research topics, given this is a longevity discussion, and I actually don't like the word, but whatever. Living longer, living better discussion. What are the sort of things that you've been looking at with some of the funding you've been getting?
So the main thing that we're excited about is reproductive aging. So specifically infertility in women. Older women. So, these egg cells that women have in their body are very unusual in terms of their cell types. So, most cells in our body turn over quite frequently throughout our lives, but women are born with all the eggs they'll ever have.
Right.
And so you've got this egg cell that's been sitting around for, literally decades. And so to me, it's the lowest hanging fruit for aging research. To wind back a little bit, my research has always been on extending lifespan and treating the underlying biology of aging.
If we're talking about Australia, how are we going in Australia when it comes to longevity? I mean, like statistically, how do we look?
Yeah, excellent. So I think we're the fourth longest lived nation in the world, which is an astounding achievement.
In a statistical sense, right. Because I think the average, as I understand, the average age of an Australian male in Australia was a little over 81 years. Females, I think, were 82 years. But I noticed in the ABS stats that came out more recently, that's dropped back a little bit.
Another one that the ABS have been really interested in was the fact that there are people aren't living longer as time goes by. So, the expectation is that average longevity goes up or life expectancy goes up. So therefore, the maximum lifespan, these people who live beyond 100, that number would continue to go up. But we aren't seeing people live, well beyond 105, 110 or anything like that.
So we're seeing more people get closer to 100, but not more people going beyond whatever the limit was before.
That's
so in other words, lifespan increase. One of the explanations of that could be just better access to health technology or a medical system.
I suspect we're living healthier lives than ever before, right? Smoking levels are as low as they've ever been. People in this country are very active. We lead a great lifestyle. Preventative healthcare is fantastic, and our medical system is fantastic. The fact that people aren't living longer in terms of the maximum lifespan, it's a hotly debated topic. So some people are saying it's evidence that there is, in fact, a maximum limit to human longevity. My personal view is that the data, the people living longer, hasn't taken into account the research that's going on in the background. So with some of the interventions that are being developed in the lab, if applied to humans, it could go beyond the 105, 110.
And what sort of interventions are we talking about now?
Yeah, so there's quite a few interventions that, reliably extend lifespan in animals. The most potent one that people would have heard about is a drug called rapamycin. So it's actually approved and used in the clinic for transplant recipients. So it's not a gentle drug. It's not something that you take as a supplement just for fun. But at least in every animal species that's been tested so far, rapamycin very reliably extends lifespan by a good 30% or so. And this is something that is effective when delivered late in life to already old animals, and it extends their lifespan even further, or even for a brief period in the middle of life. So rapamycin is a really interesting intervention that could, push out
what's it do,
lifespan.
though? Does it make me stop eating, or what's it doing?
Yeah, so it's used in transplant recipients because it stops the immune system from becoming too active.
Right.
What it actually does is control the balance between making new proteins and breaking down existing proteins. So to wind it back a bit, proteins unfolding is really bad news. So, that's been the idea of Alzheimer's research for a long time, which, that particular hypothesis may not be real. But in any case, we've got this really high concentration of proteins in our cell. And if they unfold and start becoming tangled, that's a problem. So the way rapamycin works is to stop new proteins from being synthesized and to turn on the breakdown machinery. So now you start breaking down the damaged proteins. You give the cells a chance to recover. And so once you take that away, suddenly you've gotten rid of all the damaged proteins, and now you can start growing new proteins that are hopefully less damaged.
So humans, are they trying rapamycin on humans?
Yeah, so it's used clinically, as I say, for these transplant recipients. It's used in some cancers. There's been a big movement to run these clinical trials in humans. Actually, the best chance that I see for getting better evidence for whether this actually works is this big dog trial. So companion dogs, people love, they spend a lot of time and money on. They maintain excellent records. They share a similar environment, so they're exposed to the same microbes as us. They have huge genetic diversity, just like humans. So there's this big dog age trial, which is testing rapamycin in a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial to see if it extends lifespan in dogs. And, beyond that, you would really hope that someone stumps up the money for a rapamycin longevity trial. The problem with longevity and aging research in terms of its clinical translation is it's the longest and most expensive, difficult clinical trial you could possibly imagine. I mean, by definition,
it's got to go for life.
Right, it's got to go for a lifetime. Yeah. Right. So, people are going for the lower hanging fruit, and there are some lower hanging fruit. So, things that happen that go wrong during old age. So, neurodegeneration, cardiovascular disease. The one I've been interested in is female infertility. There are some other, gum disease goes wrong during old age. So people are looking at those indications for rapamycin and other interventions in aging.
So I was listening to Dr. Peter T and also Andrew Human. They both said they've tried rapamycin, both of them.
Right.
And metformin as well.
Right.
They're not on it like all the time, but they both talked about it. And I don't know whether they've had any, they're in the United States, of course, but is Australia sort of behind the rest of the world when it comes to these things?
I don't think so. I mean, for those individuals, they're trying it on themselves. It's sort of an off-label thing.
But are you allowed to do that? Can you do that here in Australia?
If there's a GP who's willing to prescribe it to you, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So if I had a GP,
and there are some GPs who do that.
Oh, okay. So that's right. So I get that. So because rapamycin and metformin can be prescribed for certain conditions. I think metformin's for diabetes or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, metformin's it's given out like lollies to diabetics, right?
Yeah.
It's been around since the 50s. We know its safety profile. Millions and millions of people have taken metformin.
And rapamycin's for rejection of
organs.
of some sort of organ that you might have had
so they're very sick people to begin with.
Sorry?
They're very sick patients to begin with. So that's why it's a bit hard to interpret the data from people who've been taking rapamycin, at scale.
And if we're talking about Australia versus America, I guess I could sort of talk about just generally around the globe. And, there's this whole concept of blue zones. I mean, I wouldn't mind talking about blue zones for a moment. I don't know why they call them blue zones for a start, why it's blue. I guess somebody's come up with a clever idea.
Places near the ocean.
It could be
because they lead a nice life.
Is that right?
I don't know.
I think they are actually. Okinawa's in Japan, very near the ocean. Ikaria in Greece is an island in the Mediterranean. The Italian one, which the name avoids me at the moment, is near the sea. So these so-called, there's one in the United States too. So these so-called blue zones. What do you think about these generalizations that we keep hearing about?
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is everyone has their own favorite hypothesis about what's going on.
Yeah.
And I don't hold any strong opinions either way, but the one that I always like to throw out that's just to sort of stir the pot a bit is that it happens to be that these places that have extreme longevity also have extremely high rates of welfare fraud and poor record keeping. So it may be the case that all these people who are supposedly living a very long time are just taking over their mum's or dad's ID to collect welfare checks.
Oh, wow.
So that's actually an extremely well-characterized association.
Yeah.
So, interpret it with a bit of caution.
In other words, the reason why in this particular village there are 25 people who have allegedly lived past 100 years of age, it's because they're dead anyway and no one's actually known about it, and the kids are now recorded as being that person because they get a welfare check on top of their own welfare check.
I mean, there was this, I saw this report that in Japan, if you go through the welfare records, there are supposedly all these people still alive who are 120-something years of age, right?
Which is probably impossible.
Right. It's clearly that the record keeping hasn't kept up to date.
That's very interesting. So it's sort of
but
that puts a bit of damper on the world. But like,
I didn't want to put a dampener on the idea of these blue zones, though. I was just throwing it up to stir the pot a bit.
Yeah,
but
but by the way, we need to be critically examine these things because might also all be chasing the holy grail that may not even exist. In terms of 120 years anyway.
Yeah, I mean, but what they, I suppose, all do have in common is some pretty obvious aspects of their lifestyle. So they lead stress-free lives. They tend to be in beautiful locations, strong community, people get regular sleep, and healthy diets.
Yeah.
I mean, none of this is rocket science.
Yeah. Do you think that, I mean, that's actually when you say healthy diets, do you think that
what is a healthy diet?
Yeah, correct. So we talk about the Mediterranean diet. I mean, and this is one of the things I'm really keen on. Is someone saying to me, oh, you have the Mediterranean diet here in Australia, which you can. You can eat tomatoes and lettuce and cucumbers and Greek salad and olive oil, and you can have fish, a couple of times a week, and maybe not drink as much. The Mediterranean diet, but then I thought to myself, well, wait a minute. If you're looking at the island of Ikaria, and I wonder why it's only one island in Greece, because there's lots of islands in Greece and lots of people live the same sort of lifestyle. Then I started to think to myself, I wonder if the soil on the island of Greece has got some sort of elements in it, some more magnesium or more whatever it is in the soil, or it's got no soil, it's got all these rocks, or what is the case in relation to what food they are eating? What is the sunlight like? What is the rainwater like? What is the tap water like? What is the weather like? Is it hot all the time? Is it cold all the time? Do you need to get snow in the winter and boiling hot in the summer? Do you need humid weather or dry weather? There's so many variables that the blue zone seems to me to be
it's hard to
extraordinarily inaccurate,
isn't it? Yeah.
And do you know anyone who's actually doing any study on this stuff or trying to drill down into these concepts?
Yeah, so I don't know about, it's not necessarily relevant to the blue zones, but there are definitely studies of these ultra-centenarians, people who do live extremely long. So, there's a study of the genetics of Ashkenazi Jews who live past the age of 100. So there's a guy named Nir Barzilai, who's also a prominent researcher in metformin, who's been running that study. And, he's seeing some genetic associations between longevity in this population.
When you say genetic associations, in other words, genetically blessed.
Right.
They're likely, their lineage is likely to live longer no matter what.
Right.
I mean, it's subject to not smoking and doing stupid stuff.
At least based on associations anyway. We're seeing people with those genetics are living longer. So whether that's just, a cause and effect going in the wrong direction, the people with those genetics happen to also be wealthy and live a great lifestyle, who knows?
Or is it more correlation as opposed to causation?
Right.
That just so happens that those people are living longer because of the genetics.
Right.
It's got nothing to do with their lifestyle.
Right. And the other, the other study, it's not a blue zone, but it is, I suppose, relevant to blue zones is, there was a study of healthy aging men living in Concord, run out of Concord Hospital. It's called
Australia.
That's right.
In Sydney.
In Western Sydney. So it was called the CHAMP study. And so it was
CHAMP?
CHAMP.
The CHAMP study.
And it was essentially following the lifestyles of older men living out in the community, right? Just to see what would correlate with their healthy longevity or healthy aging and their overall longevity. And, one of the strongest correlations that dropped out of it was being of Mediterranean background.
Oh, really?
And eating a Mediterranean diet. So make of that what you will, right? But there is definitely a correlation there.
Yeah. So, do you ever get curious about what do they mean by Mediterranean diet?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, is it less meat? Because I know where my father comes from in Greece. There's no cows because it's mountainous.
Yep.
And cows need to graze. They ate very little meat twice a year at Easter largely, and a little bit at Christmas time, and perhaps a little bit during the year, but rarely. He did not live near the water, so he was in the mountains. So there was no fish at all, zero. And didn't eat a lot of food. They were not massive eaters. And what I remember was not a lot of food available. But what they ate was largely vegetarian because they were farmers.
Right.
And he lived to a good old age, notwithstanding he starved as a kid because the war was on. Do you think that we today, we overindulge we eat too much. Do you think there's something in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we start talking about pet hypotheses about what's going on.
Yeah.
So one of them is around protein intake, exactly what you're...
Too much?
That's right. And it's a bit counterintuitive, right? Because, the paleo diet, for example, or the Atkins diet is super effective at losing weight. People feel great on a high protein, low carb diet. But in terms of longevity, at least from the animal data we have so far, high protein, low carb diet is associated with shortened lifespan.
Wow.
And so if you're optimizing for longevity, the ratio should be flipped to high carb, low protein. Now, I mentioned this drug rapamycin earlier. So rapamycin hits a target called mTOR. It's this nutrient sensor in the cell, and it specifically senses free amino acids that come from protein. So this one drug that we have that seems to be really potent at extending lifespan targets the sensing of protein intake. Right. So when we put animals and multiple different species on these diets that have fixed ratios of protein to carb, those that are on the high carb, low protein live longest, but it comes at a cost. They end up being fat.
Right.
Because they're overeating. So it turns out our appetite is strongly tied to achieving a certain protein target. So every day we must hit this certain amount of protein. And if we don't hit it, we'll continue to feel hungry. So, when you talk about where your grandfather or grandfather grew up, one is there was probably less meat intake, but
Definitely.
The other is they wouldn't have been able to afford more meat even if they wanted to.
Correct.
Right. And so in a way, they were restricted for their protein intake. And so that's a really interesting one. Again, what makes it really counterintuitive is that protein intake is really important for building muscle mass. And if we talk to geriatricians about what they care about in old people, it's maintaining that muscle mass.
Yeah, and then that's counterintuitive to what you just said before, because in order for me to maintain my muscle mass, apart from exercising, I've got to have enough protein.
Yeah.
So, but if I'm having, is the point you're trying to make then, you got to have enough, but not too much.
Yeah, that's right. And probably at different stages of your life, you should optimize for different things. Right. So in older, frail people, we really need them to maintain muscle mass because, if they lose just a little bit of muscle mass, they can go downhill really quickly.
Yeah.
When we're younger, if you're interested in having kids, protein intake is really important. It's great for fertility. That period in between, maybe we don't need to optimize for high protein. Maybe we should be optimizing for high carb, low protein. And again, you think about these people who have very healthy lifestyles. So the Mediterranean, so high pasta or rice intake and very little meat intake. So they've got that ratio the opposite direction.
And that's quite complex though, because that is very complex because it's confusing. And I guess that's what my podcast series is about.
Yeah.
It's confusing because if you listen to, the most popular experts at the moment, that's Peter Attia and Human and David Sinclair, they espouse the importance of protein. They're always espousing the importance of protein and exercise. And by the way, if you exercise at the rates that they suggest, particularly that Peter Attia suggests, you will not be able to do that, maintain that, unless you have enough protein because you'll just tear yourself down.
Right.
You do have to have a certain amount of carbs too. But there seems to me to be the of opinion seems to be more protein. Now they're normally talking to audiences between over 50 years age. What you're just saying sort of flies in the face of that because 50 to 70 maybe sounds like the period when you probably shouldn't be eating too much protein. Or is it a function of how much exercise you're doing?
So I would say it's a function of how much exercise you're doing because if you have protein intake, there is in fact no limit to how much muscle mass you can put on without a bolus of protein. There's a book by Professor Steve Simpson and David Raubenheimer over at Sydney Uni. It's called Eat Like the Animals. So they were the world's experts at this, optimizing for nutrient ratios to extend lifespan or be fertile and dictate appetite. Maintaining muscle mass is really important. So the short answer is we don't know what that ratio should be in a human. At least in the animals, low protein extends lifespan.
And what does that mean though? When you say the ratio?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so if you imagine a big bowl of rice with a little bit of fish on top, that's a typical Okinawan diet.
Right, is that right?
Yeah, so it's high carb, low protein versus, what I actually personally enjoy eating, which is a big old chunk of steak and maybe a potato or two on the side.
Yeah, well, and that's by the way, that's a thing. Like it's an actual thing. Don't eat too much carbs.
Right.
Like people your age, my age in particular, because people my age, we worry about putting on weight, belly fat especially. We start to get concerned about, belly fat being an indicator of other types of things you might get that could kill you, in particular heart attacks. And therefore we sort of diet a little bit. Yep. And like I happen to exercise a lot, and I know if I don't have protein after exercise that I take longer to recover.
Yep.
And I also I just feel flatter,
yep.
much more flatter.
Yep.
And I don't know if that's a mental thing or like something I'm imagining, or has my body become accustomed to that level of protein?
No, I mean, I would say that we know for a fact that there are very strong cues that control our appetite that work, deep in our brain to say that if you haven't had enough protein intake, you'll still be hungry, right? So that's very clear. So I don't think you're imagining that.
So I'm just sort of spinning around this a little bit, but
it becomes really difficult, right? Because people are going to be listening to this wondering if they should starve themselves of protein.
Yeah, and have more carbs.
Right. And what I would say is you wouldn't be able to starve yourself of protein voluntarily anyway, because that drive is so strong in our brain to hit that protein target. So no one's going to be able to voluntarily, unless they're living, in poverty or in a remote Greek island. No one's actually going to be able to voluntarily restrict their protein intake. I would suggest don't eat much more than you need to.
So, okay. Well, is that a height, weight based calculation? So, for example, when you buy these protein powders,
right.
Generally speaking, they say you don't need more than 30 grams of protein.
Right.
This is like pure whey protein or something like that. Whey isolate. Is there some science in that? Maybe like, in other words, 30 grams of pure protein might equate to about a 250 gram steak is about the level of proper protein you get out of that piece of meat, which sort of intuitively says to me, Mark, you don't need more than a 250 gram steak for any one meal.
Yeah.
And Mark, and by the way, I wouldn't be able to eat two of those. I don't want to eat 500 grams of steak. My brain was that's just too much.
Right.
Like I don't feel my appetite wouldn't go that far.
Right. But if your appetite is telling you that you're full, no reason to keep pumping extra protein into your body. Our brains are fantastic at this
because I've been listening and reading that we should be having between 1.6 and 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of weight. But that's a bit unusual, sort of. Statistically, I don't quite like that because, like, if I got no muscle, just for argument's sake, if it's all fat and bone,
right?
For argument's sake, and no muscle, I'm sure that would not be the case.
Right.
I think the reason they want you to have between 1.6 and 2.2 grams per kilogram of weight is based on an assumption as to how much muscle mass you have.
Right.
Because that's
how much muscle mass you need to put on.
And what you need to build as well.
I'm not an expert at how they came up with these intake guidelines for protein intake. But it intuitively makes sense that it's proportional to how much lean mass you have.
And there must be a general assumption that the average amount of fat for a person relative to the whole body weight might be 30% or somewhere between 20 and 30%.
Right.
Which is probably about right. I mean, there are people who are either side of that, but they're probably outliers in terms of a total population.
Yep.
Is there danger in any one of us listening to those sorts of conversations and not knowing statistically where we fit within the range?
Yeah, potentially. I mean,
because we're all self-medicating ourselves with protein. Right. We're self-medicating ourselves with, carbohydrates. We're self-medicating ourselves with training systems. We're self-medicating ourselves with the amount of sleep we need to have because we know that we hear someone who's got this, high profile of intellectual knowledge and respect in the community, your community, the scientific community. We then go off and start self-medicating for ourselves because every one of us is different.
Yeah, right. I mean, so, okay, just lay it out there. I'm not a nutritional epidemiologist. That's a whole field, and they'd have opinions on how much protein you need to have. But I definitely believe it's the case that if you don't feel like eating something and you're trying to force it into your body because you think it's going to be good for your health, don't do that, right? Don't overeat or undereat if it makes you unhappy. Yeah,
because it's funny. I know
brains are very good at this.
I know some guys are bodybuilders. Well, I haven't seen them for a while, but I used to know them. but like competitive bodybuilders. And they used to tell me they would eat every 2 hours, not 5 times a day, but every 2 hours, and actually would get up in the middle of the night and have some food, wake up, set an alarm, get up and have like a protein shake or something like that in the middle of the night. They also had a lot of carbs as well during that period whilst they were building. But they would also say that they had so much food that it got to a point where they couldn't eat it and they would feel like they're going to choke. Like they just couldn't actually get it down. And that is intuitively, to me, that sounded like they were giants, like in terms of muscle mass. But intuitively, it told me that they weren't meant to have that amount of muscle mass, and they weren't meant to eat that much amount of food. Now they're doing it for a show,
right?
They're trying to win a competition or something like that. So I think what you're saying, like from just an intuitive point of view, it makes sense. Listen to what our bodies tells us.
Yeah,
and every one of us is completely different too.
That's right. But I guess where it starts to become really important is frail older people. So in those older people, really the struggle is to get them to maintain muscle mass and eat anything.
Is that someone with I can't remember what it's called now, but when you sarcopenia?
Yeah, when you start to lose muscle mass.
How do you know that you are in that sarcopenia phase, which is when you're losing muscle mass? Apart from the fact you're old, but when do you know?
When you know, that's a good question. I mean, the clearest sign is losing weight. So I'll tell you one study. It's astonishing. So it's looking at the impact of bed rest on muscle mass in older people. So basically, it just gets some older people to lie down in bed for 5 days, which happens all the time.
Yeah.
So in that 5 days, they lose 2 kilograms of muscle mass. So just have a think about that, right? Imagine some sirloin steaks, which is my favorite cut of meat. 4 or 5 of those babies, and having that cut out of your body. Just imagine what it does to your body. And that just takes not getting out of bed for 5 days.
And that is what sarcopenia is. Is that
right.
sarcopenia?
That's it.
And when you say older people, we're talking about over 70. What are we talking about?
I think it was over 80.
Over 80.
Right. And so, that's going to happen at some point in our lives. And so when it happens to me, I'm hoping that I go into old age with a reserve of muscle mass. Right.
Yeah. Well, and that's sort of the thesis that Atia and all those people were talking about. Right. You've got to build it now because you're not going to build it overnight.
Right.
It takes a long time, and then you've got to maintain it.
Right. And we're really good at building it when we're younger.
Yeah.
And so that speaks to, when a high protein diet may be appropriate or less appropriate. Young guys, young men and women who want to look good, want to lose weight, a high protein diet is probably, and we know for a fact it's effective at losing weight and looking ripped, right? People look great and, they have higher circulating levels of sex hormone levels. They're more fertile. So that could be a good time to have a high protein intake.
It's interesting because if I'm nearly 70. So if I'm trying to,
you're looking good for nearly 70.
Yeah, thank you. But I think it's genetics. But if I'm trying to, well, actually it's not because I've been really conscious of these things for a long, long time. But if I'm trying to prepare myself when I get to 80, not to have an accident,
right,
not to fall over, to be able to also from a not so much a lifespan point of view, but just from a health span point of view, be able to enjoy myself, to be able to do certain things, pick grandkids up, go for a run around the park with them or whatever. I need to have a certain level of muscle mass in order to move all my limbs and also to have strength. So that suggests to me that right now, 10 years prior to that 80th birthday, or 11 years prior to that 80th birthday, that I need to either build more muscle mass or maintain muscle mass where I have it.
Yep.
Which suggests to me it's harder to maintain muscle mass at my age than ever before.
It is doable, right?
It's doable, but you've got to do more. You've got to do more resistance work.
Yeah, that's right.
More than I've ever done before.
Yeah.
Not necessarily heavier, but definitely more diligently is probably a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
You can't miss 2 weeks.
Yep.
You can't miss a month through injury. If you do, it's really hard to recover.
Yep.
But then it tells me if I'm being consistent at the training environment, the strategy around my exercise, that I've also got to be equally focused on the nutrition I have in my system and the amount of energy, and you talked about it before, that my mitochondria can produce for my cells to contract, either fast or slow. So all of a sudden we're back to where we started. because my cells are getting older, my mitochondria is getting more lazy or less responsive, etc. So it sort of tells me that I've got to be really strict, therefore, in relation to my protein intake. See, the people that you're talking about in Okinawa, they're probably not doing the same exercise regime that I might be talking about to prepare myself for when I'm 80.
I mean, they are certainly active, is my understanding.
Yeah, I'm talking about building muscle.
They're not lifting weights. That's
correct.
Right. Yeah,
they might be carrying a bucket of water from down the mountain or something, right. But I'm sure they're not picking up rocks and moving, right. building dry stone walls and stuff like that anymore. It's someone else within the community is doing that, which is one of the reasons why these communities work so well. So if we wind that back, it sort of suggests to me, Mark, there's no point you looking at that blue zone in Okinawa. And probably the same one as the one in Ikaria, because it's like there's a big community there. They're not interested in building muscle as such. They're not doing exercise. They don't have access even to gyms. They don't go to a gym. They're active. That's enough to sort of make you okay, but it's not going to optimize you. And I'm talking about optimization here. They're probably not even thinking to themselves, how can I bend down and pick my two-year-old grandkid up?
I guess what we could learn from them is the aspects of their life they enjoy now, right? So they maintain a strong sense of community.
Yeah.
They lead stress-free lives. And, that's quite frankly enjoyable at any time of your life.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not going to hurt your longevity.
No, it won't hurt your longevity. And I think you're right about the stress-free bit because, we sit here in Australia, you and I sitting here right now, we're in the middle of Darlinghurst. There's traffic outside. We both take transport to work. Either we don't work from home. We either travel by public transport or we drive. But in both cases, there's a lot of traffic. Then there's a lot of people. Like in those small villages, there's not a lot of people. There's a lot of people who can annoy the shit out of you as well. I live a stressful life in my work environment because it's extraordinarily competitive, the work environment I work in, my day-to-day job, as opposed to this stuff. This stuff is like unbelievably fun to me. Like it's amazing fun for me compared to what I do day to day. So I live a high level of stress, a high level of cortisol is being flushed through my system, like from the moment I wake up, literally to the moment I go to bed at night. All of which sort of probably has a toll on my system, including my energy levels. I can't imagine that my mitochondrial system is working efficiently if it's getting flushed with stress hormones all the time. So therefore, to some extent, our penchant for chasing these otherwise unreachable blue zones around the world, maybe we should stop talking about that.
Yeah.
Because, how are we going to achieve it?
They may not be real.
Yeah. Well, number one, they may not be real for the reason you mentioned before, or at least not as whole as we are led to believe.
Right.
There's going to be pockets of them which, you can poke holes at in a statistical sense because there's some error in the statistics. Therefore, what should we be chasing here in Australia? What should we be sort of aspiring to? I mean,
there are some practical things that are being pushed at the moment in older care. So, you mentioned resistance training, and people seem to think that stops at a certain age, that you can get away without, lifting weights. But, old, frail people in a nursing home lifting weights is fantastic for their health. There's very strong data. Some of this data was from the University of Sydney, just over across town, showing that, older people lifting weights have incredible health benefits beyond just muscle mass. Some other things, there's intergenerational living. So the idea of, you would have seen this ABC series where little kids spend time in nursing homes. Again, has fantastic impacts on the older people, benefits that far exceed anything we could hope to achieve with a drug. There are many lifestyle changes we could make today at scale for the care of older people that would improve their lives.
What about people in their middle age? When I say middle age, between 40 and 60, I mean, what should they be doing to prepare themselves? Because I can't imagine if between 40 and 60, so in other words, maybe they've had their family, they don't need protein as much. They're sort of past that sort of ego period. where they've got to look, cut and all that sort of stuff. And they maybe are eating a greater amounts of carbs compared to protein. They start to sort of lose their way a little bit.
Yep.
What should those people be thinking about? Because they want when they get to 80, they want to be in good shape.
Yeah, good question. So the safest answer I can give is to maintain that muscle mass, to continue to do resistance training and exercise. That's the safest answer because diet is debatable and not necessarily always achievable. And people doing exercise have immediate benefits and feel good.
So it looks like the non-negotiable is exercise.
That's right.
Yeah. So of the three, we've got 4 strategies, I guess. So it's, purpose and community. Let's call that one strategy. You've got to have a purpose and a community. One thing is for sure about the blue zones, so-called blue zones. They're all got community is a big part of that, and purpose within the community. In other words, I've got a role.
Yep.
And I'm either the grandfather or my job is got to take the rubbish out every whatever. But I've got this purpose community. That's one, and that's probably there's no dispute on that one. The second strategy has to be around what I eat, but the strategy around our food intake, it seems to be a little bit difficult. We're not sure how much protein, how much, the example given before, rice, etc. What type of protein, what type of rice, how often a day, what time of day. That's a bit confusing. The third strategy would be sleep. You've got to get your rest. You must sleep.
That's right.
And which is quite funny because when I was in my 20s, you were nearly a superhero if you could live on 4 or 5 hours sleep a night.
Yeah, that's right.
Now it's.
I don't think that's changed. People still take that attitude.
Really?
And the unfortunate part about the importance of sleep, that's not unfortunate. Sleep is great, but society can't function without shift workers.
Yeah.
There are certain occupations that we just need to keep society ticking over.
Well, those poor buggers might not make it though. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's if
they're sleep deprived.
That's right. That's right. So, I guess that means they need to take extra care of their health later in life, not maintain that lifestyle, forever. Well, and we need to compensate them well, I guess.
Well, I hope we do because we're taking something quite important away from them.
Right.
That they probably don't even realize. And the fourth strategy, therefore, which seems to be the one that is not negotiable, and that's your fitness program or your strategy around exercise. So we've got exercise, sleep, nutrition, purpose and community, which is just one. Those 4 things, they're pretty simple.
Yeah, that's right.
They're obvious sort of things.
That's right. Some people look in on the aging research field and they want to look at what they can do now and they see it's these obvious things that their grandparents could have told them about. And they're like, well, this isn't a field of research. This is not serious. But, that's where we're at the moment for being able to give advice to people, those, old school advice that their grandparents would have had.
Yeah, because when I was a kid, my grandparents on my mum's side always said, you have, it sounds a bit silly today, but meat and 3 veg. So, and the 3 veg was always much bigger than the meat, than the piece of meat.
Yeah, that's right.
But it was 3 vegetables, and it wasn't like a bowl of mashed potato. It wasn't a bowl of pasta. It was like some greens and some a coloured vegetable, probably carrots, and then there might have been a bit of spud, a bit of potato in there, and there would be a piece of meat. And that's what, and in the morning you ate porridge, and or wheat bix, and in the evening no one ate late. Everybody ate because my dad worked factory. Dad got home at 4:00. We'd all be eating at 6:00, and people weren't eating at 8:30, 9:30, or 10 o'clock at night. And sleep was an important part of everything. Exercise was not something that was looked at. Exercise. No one ever really thought about resistance training. When I grew up, there was no such thing as a gym. There was no gyms with weights in them. I'm talking about. There was swimming pools and stuff like that, but nobody did weights. Obviously there's bodybuilders, but generally speaking, the normal person did not go to the gym. My father didn't. Definitely, I never saw him go to the gym. As opposed to me, as a grandfather, I'm a grandfather now. My grandkids see me go to the gym. And so the world has changed. What do you think it has? What has causes? What has our change in our sort of psyche? Do you think that's made us become much more aware of it? Is it because we've got more money and we become greedy and want to live longer?
Look, I think the simple answer, exactly as you say, is that we're a wealthier society.
Yeah,
people have the time to think about this and the bandwidth to worry about their health. and can spend money on gyms and gym memberships and getting fit.
Yeah,
I think it's actually a healthy reflection on our society.
But do you think that's also, and I think I agree. I think that's sort of right. But I think it's driven from us wanting to indulge ourselves in the wonderful things that life has to offer for a much longer period, because we can,
right?
Because we got the money to live longer. We never had 40, 50 years ago. We didn't have the money to live longer.
Yeah.
Someone who was 80, 40, 50 years ago or 70 wasn't thinking about living another 30 years. They're thinking, I'm going to live another 5 years or 10 years maybe.
And I guess the big shift we're seeing at the moment is people actually thinking about how long they want to live or could live.
Yeah.
That's never happened until, very recently, maybe 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It wasn't a topic of conversation. It was just this fixed thing, and that was kind of it, right? Save enough money and time to keep you alive, but not necessarily worry about your health. I think it's healthy that people are starting to become aware of this and worry about it.
It's unhealthy.
I shouldn't say worry. One thing I've noticed that is not a positive change is people almost become hypochondriacs about their longevity.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're doing something that's not enjoyable and not fun now, forget about it. It's not going to be beneficial for your lifespan.
And it's a good point, because I actually get a bit worried about people too, because some people feel as though that there's proxies out there in the world that they've got to try and be close to, like be equivalent of. And you look at people like Peter T, and I'm not here to criticize Peter T, and he's doing a great job of, building knowledge about this topic. But there's people out there will be thinking, well, I've got to be like that.
Mm.
And he exercises for a couple of hours a day. Most people don't have that time to do that, a couple of hours exercise every day.
Yeah. I mean, I was on a panel with this guy who was saying that he would take 60 supplements every morning.
60?
60 pills. Go out and live your life, man.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's all right for him, but all of us should look to him and say, I got to be like that.
So he'd taken that inspiration from, one of these public figures in the longevity advocacy field.
Someone like Brian Johnson.
It was Brian Johnson.
Right.
Brian. And that's almost, the guy's almost comedic, right? I actually started to appreciate his sense of humor.
Well, he's an experiment on himself.
Yeah, that's right. And,
and he can afford to do it.
Exactly.
I mean, we're talking someone who spends a couple of $1 million a year on himself, just his longevity quest.
Right.
And I guess he looks younger. He looks pretty good. I've seen photos with him with his shirt off. He's fairly ripped compared to what he used to be like when he was in when he was a tech bro, where he made all his money. But equally, it's not attainable for most of us.
Right.
Most of us aren't ever going to get there.
Yeah. Blood transfusions from your kids is not a scalable solution.
From your kids? Yeah, exactly. My kids wouldn't let me take their blood. I'm pretty sure they want to hang on to it for themselves. So where do you think then a sensible position should be for us as a nation, as a country?
Like I say, we already have outstanding health systems. Preventative healthcare is fantastic in this nation. We could probably do better at the care of older people. So nursing homes, suffer from just being under-resourced and not getting enough staff. I mentioned things like resistance training. Again, that research came out of Australia, out of the University of Sydney.
Oh, really?
And we've done really well there. So that's, I think, where we could go as a nation, or what we could do as a nation now. In the future, I'm hoping, and as a field, we're hoping there will be drugs that are, have clinical evidence to show a protection against age-related disease. So whether it be rapamycin, metformin, some of these NAD precursors that I'm working on, hopefully one of those will come through and, have strong evidence to show that we can extend overall lifespan, but more importantly, delay age-related disease.
Just finally, I did notice in my notes that you have co-authored papers with Dr. David Sinclair.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he recruited me to UNSW.
Right. So, but he was, when you did your PhD or?
No, this is would have been 10 years ago to actually set up our lab at UNSW.
So is he still in Australia? I thought he was in America.
No, he's in the United States.
He's in the United States.
But he was an adjunct a conjoint at UNSW for a while.
Yeah, okay. So he was there for a while, was he? And he's like a rock star in the United States these days when it comes to longevity. The whole discussion. Where do you think he's at? Like, what is he saying? Where do you do you have conversations? Do you follow him? Do you read his stuff?
Yeah, we're good mates. I mean, the last time he came out to the country, he flew in for my wedding, which was lovely. Where he's at in terms of his lab's research at the moment is in reprogramming.
What's that mean?
So this is epigenetic reprogramming. So this is the idea of turning back the clock basically to being an early embryo to start again. So we know that as we get older, in fact, not even as we get older, as we grow into a human being, our cells differentiate. They turn into different cell types. So for example, skin cells, brain cells, liver cells, whatever. And that's all down to how our DNA is being turned on or off. And, we've got the same DNA in every cell, but it's what we call the epigenetics. So whether those genes are on or off. Now, that can drive whether they turn into certain cell types, or it can drive whether your cells continue to divide anymore. And sort of the dream is that we could rewind the clock on our DNA to essentially go back to the early embryo stage and then have fresh cells, completely erase the slate. So that's the dream. And, this technology was used first to, it's what we call induced pluripotency. It's where you take adult cells, for example, skin cells, you grow them in a dish, and you can rewind them back to being embryonic stem cells.
Wow.
And so you can do this in a dish. So this was discovered in the early 2000s, and I could go on a bit about this. The history of this discovery is really interesting, and it's really illuminating for how to think about this. So the original experiment in the 1960s, this British guy, Sir John Gurdon. So the idea at the time was that DNA becomes damaged as we grow old, and that's what drives aging, right? So what he did is he took a skin cell from an adult frog, so it's old DNA. And he then put that into a frog egg cell. And he was using frogs because they have massive eggs and it's just one cell. So you can take out the egg cell DNA and put in that old DNA. Now, in theory, it's old DNA. It's become damaged over time, right? And yet it leads to a completely healthy frog. That egg grows up, it goes through normal development, and it's perfectly healthy. It's fine. So somehow something floating around in that egg cell is able to rewind the clock of old DNA. And you can actually repeat that experiment for 100 generations, and they're fine. So something floating around in the egg is driving turning the clock back on our DNA. It took until 2006, I think, a Japanese fellow by the name of Shinya Yamanaka actually figured out what those factors were. And those are the factors that are used to create stem cells today. So that was, 2006, 2007. So we've been growing stem cells in a dish for a long time since then, basically, since the discovery of those four factors. And I know where David Sinclair at and many others in the field is trying to do this inside the body. So if we could deliver those factors to existing tissue inside the body, whether we could rewind the clock back to essentially being a stem cell and then grow completely fresh tissue.
And is that to sort of stop, I don't know, cancer growths, or what is the purpose of it? Is it just to get us back to being young again, or? Yeah,
that's right. So the idea is if you, rewind that clock, you could, reset longevity, I suppose is the dream. Now, the big caveat is that when you rewind the clock, if you go back too far, when those cells go to differentiate again, they won't necessarily differentiate into the cell type you want. And so that's called a teratoma. And it's almost like a type of tumor that grows inside the body. So that's a very risky strategy. But if you could just tickle that epigenetic clock, if you could just rewind it a little bit, the hope is you could rewind aspects of aging.
So where are they up to now? Have they put any papers out, or they?
When you think about low-hanging fruit again for aging research, the one that they looked at a few years ago was the optic nerve. So this is the nerve going from the eye back to the brain. Now, if you damage that at the moment, those nerves, they can't regrow. But if you reprogram them back to the embryonic state using these reprogramming factors, that nerve can regrow. And at least in animals, you can restore vision.
Wow.
Right? So it's potentially a very powerful but very risky strategy. That's where his lab is at the moment.
Is it being done here in Australia, or is all that overseas, all in the US?
Yeah, so reprogramming as a technology, there's a lot of research on epigenetics and reprogramming. It's all about how to apply it in a safe way. That's the tricky part. There are plenty of reprogramming epigenetic specialists around in Australia. In fact, just up the road from us in Darlinghurst in Sydney, I know many researchers working on this. I don't know that they're working on it in the context of aging. The main reason people work on epigenetics, I think, around here is for cancer research.
Right. But Sinclair is working on it in relation to aging.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And we go back to that same old question. I mean, maybe we've been doing this for 10,000 years. I wouldn't have a clue. But it seems to me that if someone can crack this code or help us age more slowly, or in fact even reverse it, a bit like Donald Trump, they could end up becoming the president of the United States or president of the whole world.
Right.
What is that? I mean, why have we got this massive?
Why is it a new thing? Is what you're asking?
Yeah. Well, it looks like a new thing, but why is we got this massive interest in that?
So I will say that people like David Sinclair, Andrew Huberman, and so on are excellent public communicators.
Yeah.
And they've been extremely active in driving the field in the public eye.
Building a movement.
Yeah. I think that's safe to say. And, I've been working in aging research not as long as they have, since 2010, early 2010s. And at the time, it was kind of a fringe topic. I think people at the time were aware of telomeres, the fact that telomeres were these bits of our DNA that became shorter with age.
As we get older.
Right. But, these days, I think with these books that have been released to the mainstream, that's really helped push the field in the public imagination. From a scientific perspective, I think it holds huge promise. If we could develop a drug that treated multiple aspects, the underlying biology of aging, imagine all the diseases we could treat, the impacts it would have on public health budgets.
Yeah, and the economic impact would be enormous. But our population would also probably become an issue, because the population would never really die.
Yeah.
Well, it would, but it'd die off at a slower rate. So that in itself has economic sort of impacts. It's quite it's complex. It's not without its issues.
Right.
Like if we're 7.5 billion people in the world, if all of a sudden we kept producing kids, and but the 7.5 billion at the top end never really moved. They kept just living longer and longer and longer.
Right.
We're going to have a bigger and bigger resource problem, and a bigger and bigger environmental problem, and a bigger and bigger everything else problem, overcrowding problem. But I guess if that's on a total population, but any one individual would rather be one of the ones who's at the top and stays on this planet for longer.
Right.
We'd all back ourselves to survive better than anybody else. I can sort of see the point. For me, the reason I'm doing Project 100, by the way, is because I'm just curious about this whole topic.
Yep.
And it's also confusing. And the more I read and the more I hear, and the more confused I get, actually, because I'm not a scientist. But I guess what I wanted to do is talk to people like you and ask the questions that us non-scientists would like to ask, because a lot of the problems with those individuals who are building awareness and doing a great job, they talk to each other and it gets very dense. Like it gets complex,
right?
And most people zone out because they go, "Oh my God, what are they talking about?" Right. And other than someone who might have particular interest in science, or who in fact is a scientist, so they build awareness, but at the same time, it's very, very complex, or so complex and confusing that it becomes unattainable, and you lose interest all of a sudden. Mm. So that's the objective of this show, is to speak to people like you. And my preference is to speak to Aussies, by the way, because I don't think the rest of the world controls this. I think Australians are as good as anyone in the world at this stuff. I'm happy to talk to Peter or Andrew Huberman if they want to come and talk to me. But nonetheless, I think Australia has this capability. And what do you think about it? Do you think, you're a scientist, you're a researcher, senior researcher. You read all the papers that are written in all the accredited journals. Do we bat above our weight?
Yeah, look, at aging research, absolutely. There's some fantastic stuff coming out. It probably isn't publicized as much overseas. And I think the other thing that we're doing is starting to change in Australia is that previously we were doing basic research, really, really fundamental basic research that wasn't being applied to the question of aging, if you know what I mean. Yep. So I mentioned, the detailed work on epigenetics just up the road here, or metabolism just up the road here. That's really important for aging. And, I've in the past set up conference series where we try and get people who have this basic research and get them to focus it on aging research. On the global scale, if you look at the number of papers, academic papers that are published per dollar public investment, Australia's the most efficient in the world.
Wow.
We are incredibly productive when it comes to scientific research. In the field of aging research in particular, it's really starting to change. We're really starting to see researchers drive their work towards applications in aging. And so in terms of where the basic research is at, I think it's quite strong. I'm quite proud of what we're doing at UNSW in female fertility and extending reproductive lifespan. And there are people doing, as I mentioned, fantastic work on nutrient sensing and how much we should eat, what nutrients we should be eating. That's out of University of Sydney. There's also fantastic work at a clinical level, tracking older people and looking for these risk factors. So I think we're doing well.
Well, that makes me happy because, I'm heading into that territory and I want to make sure that I want to make sure in a very selfish way that I have the right people around me for the future. So Dr. Lindsay Wu, I really appreciate your time. Thanks very much, mate.
Thanks for having me.
Hopefully we can catch up again.
Yeah,
that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, mate.